She never planned to fall in love with him, but from the very first moment her eyes met his, something inside her shifted in a way she could not explain. Isabella had lived her entire life in a mansion of glass and gold, a place where every hallway whispered her father's power, and every room reminded her that she was not free. Her father, Richard Moretti, was one of the wealthiest men in the city, known for building an empire of steel, real estate, and influence. To him, Isabella was more than just his daughter. She was a piece on his chessboard, meant to strengthen alliances and ensure the Moretti name would never fall from its high place. She had grown up surrounded by chandeliers that glowed like captive stars, silk gowns laid out for her before every event, and parties where laughter never reached the eyes of the guests. But despite all the glitter, Isabella felt like a bird, trapped in a cage, wings clipped before she could ever try to fly. And then one summer evening, at a banquet that should have been like all the others, she noticed him. He was not dressed in a tailored suit or polished shoes. He was not one of her father's partners or her mother's carefully chosen friends. He was simply a waiter, moving quietly through the crowd, balancing trays with a grace that came from years of hard work. His name was Daniel, though she did not know it yet. What caught her attention first was not his work, but the way he carried himself, not bowed, not timid, but calm and steady, as if he had nothing to prove to anyone. When his eyes met hers across the crowded room, something flickered and Isabella felt her breath catch. At first it seemed impossible that someone like her could even exchange more than a glance with someone like him. Her father's watchful eyes were everywhere, and the mansion buzzed with gossip carried by servants who knew better than to cross the family's will. But fate has a way of working in small moments, and in the chaos of serving dozens of demanding guests, Daniel found himself close enough to hand Isabella a glass of water. His hand brushed hers, just for a second, and his smile lingered a heartbeat too long. Isabella lowered her gaze quickly, but the warmth of that brief touch followed her the rest of the night. She caught herself searching for him as she walked among the guests, ignoring the shallow compliments and empty laughter of men her father wanted her to notice. She only saw the quiet waiter with dark, thoughtful eyes. She did not know that this was the beginning of something that would change her life forever, pulling her into a love so deep it would defy her family's wealth, but also into a truth so dark it could shatter her world. The days that followed should have blurred into the same pattern of duties Isabella had endured for years. Morning lessons with her mother's chosen tutors, afternoons spent preparing for events, evenings lost in the golden halls of the mansion. But she found her mind wandering back to that moment in the banquet hall. She could not stop thinking about the stranger who smiled without expectation, whose eyes seemed to see her, not her father's fortune. She tried to bury the thought, reminding herself that she was Isabella Moretti, daughter of one of the most powerful men in the city. She had no business thinking about a waiter, no business imagining what it would feel like to hear his voice, to know his story. And yet, as fate would have it, another chance came. The Moretti estate was hosting yet another gathering, smaller this time, but still overflowing with guests. Isabella had slipped away from the main hall, exhausted by the empty chatter, and wandered into the back corridor where the servants moved swiftly, balancing trays and carrying wine bottles. That was when she saw him again. Daniel was bent over a tray, adjusting the glasses with steady hands, and for a moment, she simply watched him. He noticed her presence and straightened, surprised to see her there. She expected him to bow awkwardly or retreat, as most servants did when caught alone with her. But instead he gave a simple nod and said quietly, "Evening, miss." The sound of his voice was unexpected, low, steady, and carrying a weight she could not define. She felt her throat tighten, but she managed to answer, "Evening." The word felt clumsy on her tongue, as though it was too small for the storm rising inside her. For a long moment neither of them moved, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Then footsteps echoed from the hall, and Isabella turned sharply, disappearing before anyone could see her lingering in the servants' passage. That night she lay awake in her vast room with its velvet curtains and golden mirrors, replaying the sound of his voice again and again. She was restless, unable to shake the feeling that something extraordinary was beginning. From then on, Isabella found herself drawn to places she had never cared to visit before. The kitchens, the garden paths where staff often passed, the side corridors that her parents ignored. Each time she hoped, without admitting it to herself, that she would see him again. And she did. Their encounters grew more frequent, though always by chance and always brief. A smile exchanged over a tray of dishes, a whisper of greeting in a hallway, a shared glance across a crowded room. It was dangerous, reckless even, but she felt alive in those fleeting moments in a way she never had before. Daniel, for his part, remained cautious. He was kind, yes, but reserved, never overstepping the invisible line that separated them. Still, there was something in his eyes that betrayed the feelings he tried to bury, something warm, something longing. And in the quiet corners of her heart, Isabella began to imagine what it might be like if that line did not exist. It was not long before she found a way to cross it. One evening, when the estate hosted a late dinner, Isabella deliberately slipped into the garden while the guests were distracted. She stood beneath the old oak tree, the night air cool against her skin, her heart pounding with both fear and excitement, and then she saw him. Daniel had come out to the garden carrying empty glasses, his expression surprised when he spotted her waiting. "What are you doing here?" he asked softly, his voice laced with caution. Isabella looked at him, her chin lifted, and answered, "I needed air, and I hoped you'd be here too." The admission hung in the silence between them, fragile and daring. For the first time, Daniel's guard slipped. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar on his cheek, the way his eyes darkened with unspoken feelings. "This is dangerous," he said, his words a warning but his tone betraying his own desire. Isabella smiled faintly. "I've lived my whole life being told what's dangerous. Maybe I want to choose for myself." And in that moment, their story truly began. From that night beneath the oak tree, their bond grew quickly, though always in the shadows, always under the threat of discovery. Isabella felt a thrill each time she slipped away from her father's carefully curated world of crystal glasses and polished speeches, only to find herself in the quiet presence of Daniel. He was not like the men she had been introduced to since childhood, those who wore expensive suits and spoke in rehearsed tones about profits and alliances. Daniel spoke with honesty, each word unpolished but alive. He did not flatter her in the way she had grown used to, but listened, truly listened, to her dreams, her frustrations, her longing to escape the golden cage of her life. And in return, he shared pieces of himself, though carefully, as if each confession carried weight. He told her of books he read in the dim hours after work, about the quiet peace he found walking by the river, about his hopes for a life that was his own. Isabella clung to these glimpses of him, each revelation another stone laid in the secret path they were building together. Their stolen moments became lifelines. Sometimes it was only a brief exchange in the garden, her hand brushing his for a second too long as he handed her a flower plucked from the hedges. Other times, they managed to meet in quiet cafes away from the estate, Isabella disguised in plain clothing, her heart pounding with the risk of being seen. Those hours in the city were the most precious of all. They would walk along the riverbanks, their voices soft in the night, laughter spilling from them as if the world outside could not touch them. Isabella began to discover parts of herself she had never known existed, a boldness, a hunger for freedom, a joy in simple things. For the first time in her life, she was not Richard Moretti's daughter. She was simply Isabella, a young woman in love. Yet even in their brightest moments, Daniel carried a shadow in his eyes, a heaviness he never fully explained. She noticed how he would sometimes grow quiet when she asked about his family or his past, how his smile would falter before he covered it again. She told herself not to press, that everyone had scars, and love was about trusting even when you did not know every detail. But in the deepest corners of her heart, she wondered what secrets he held so tightly. As their love deepened, the walls around them began to close in. Isabella's father, sharp-eyed and suspicious, noticed her increasing absences, the way she seemed distracted at dinners, her eyes no longer fixed on the suitors he paraded before her. Richard Moretti was not a man easily deceived. He had built his empire on knowing what others hid, on reading weakness like words on a page. He began to assign his men to watch her, though Isabella was clever, slipping past them with excuses that were half-truths. Still, the pressure grew. At home, her mother scolded her for her defiance, reminding her of her duty, of the expectations she was born into. "You are a Moretti," her mother repeated, as though it were a curse carved into her skin. But Isabella could not turn back. Each time she looked into Daniel's eyes, she knew she would rather lose the mansion, the jewels, the entire gilded world she had been trapped in than lose him. It was a terrifying revelation, but also liberating. For the first time in her life, she was making a choice for herself. Daniel, too, was caught between desire and fear. He loved Isabella with a depth that startled him, a devotion that kept him awake at night. But he knew what she did not, that his past was not a simple story, not something easily left behind. He had tried to build a new life, one of honesty and hard work, but the world did not forget so easily. He worried constantly that the truth would come out, that it would destroy the fragile happiness they had built. Sometimes, late at night after their meetings, he would walk alone through the city, his mind replaying the mistakes of his youth, the dark alleys and desperate choices that had nearly consumed him. He told himself he should let her go, that her world was too bright, too fragile to be stained by his shadows. But when he saw her smile, when he felt her hand slip into his, all his resolve crumbled. He could not let her go. He would rather risk everything than lose her. It was not long before cracks began to appear in their secret. One evening, Isabella returned home late, her cheeks flushed from laughter, and her hair wind-blown from the river breeze. Her father's chief advisor, a cold-eyed man named Victor, was waiting in the hallway. He said nothing, only watched her with a knowing smirk as she passed. The next day, Isabella overheard her father questioning the staff, his voice low but edged with fury. She knew then that discovery was no longer a distant fear. It was a storm gathering on the horizon. That night she met Daniel in the garden again, the shadows deep around them. "They're starting to suspect," she whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched his. Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes dark. "Then maybe this has to end," he said, though the words seemed to tear at him. Isabella shook her head fiercely. "No, I can't lose you. I won't." The strength in her voice surprised them both. Daniel pulled her close, holding her as though the world was already against them. "Then we fight," he murmured, though his eyes betrayed the fear he carried inside. What Isabella did not know was that the danger was greater than her father's wrath. Daniel's past was not a closed chapter, no matter how much he wanted it to be. The men he had once known, men who thrived in the shadows of the city, had not forgotten him. To them, Daniel was unfinished business, a man who had walked away when loyalty should have bound him. Their whispers had started again, their presence lurking in corners of the places he worked. He tried to shield Isabella from this, keeping his fears hidden, but each day it became harder. The more their love grew, the more he feared the day it would all collapse. He wanted to tell her the truth, but he feared it would break her trust, that she would look at him differently, that she would see him not as the man she loved, but as the boy who had once stumbled into darkness. For now, he stayed silent, clinging to the fragile hope that their love could withstand what was coming. The storm that Isabella had sensed soon became impossible to ignore. At first it was subtle, the way her father's men began to appear in places they hadn't before, their eyes following her every move. When she visited the library, 2 of them waited outside the building pretending to read newspapers. When she walked to the market, another appeared by the stalls pretending to inspect fruit. She tried to remain calm, to act as though she noticed nothing, but inside her chest her heart hammered with dread. Each secret meeting with Daniel felt more dangerous, each shared moment more fragile, as though one false step could shatter everything they had built. Yet the risk only seemed to strengthen her resolve. Love, she realized, was not a luxury. It was a rebellion. Every smile, every kiss, every whispered promise became an act of defiance against the gilded cage her father had locked around her since birth. She knew the cost would be high, but she no longer cared. Daniel noticed her tension, though she tried to hide it. One evening, when they sat in their favorite cafe tucked into a quiet corner of the city, he reached across the table and took her hand. "They're watching you," he said softly, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "I can see it. It's only a matter of time before they corner me." His words made Isabella's chest tighten, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Then let them," she whispered fiercely. "Let them see I choose you. I'm not afraid of them." Daniel's gaze lingered on her, a storm of love and fear battling in his eyes. He wanted to believe in her strength, but he also knew what her family was capable of. Richard Moretti was not merely wealthy. He was powerful, connected to men who could make lives vanish with a single order. Daniel had seen enough of that world from the outside to know its ruthlessness. "They will try to break us," he said, his voice low. "And if they can't break us, they will destroy me." Isabella squeezed his hand tighter. "Then we will stand together. No secrets, no lies." Her words pierced him, and for a moment he considered telling her everything. The past he had hidden, the shadows that followed him. But the words caught in his throat. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate within the mansion. Servants spoke in hushed voices about Isabella's absences, about the strange intensity in her father's eyes when he asked them questions. Her mother grew colder, her scolding sharper, though she never mentioned Daniel by name. It was as if the entire household could feel the presence of something forbidden, like a crack spreading across glass. Isabella bore it with silent defiance, her chin raised higher, her steps more deliberate. But at night, alone in her room, fear sometimes overtook her. She would sit by the window, staring out into the garden where she had first spoken to Daniel, her tears silent, but relentless. Love gave her strength, but it also left her exposed. The more she loved him, the more she realized how much she stood to lose. Yet she could not let him go. To give him up would be to surrender her very self, and that she would never do. The first real confrontation came one evening when she returned home later than expected. Richard Moretti was waiting in the grand hall, his posture rigid, his expression like stone. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with danger. Isabella felt her breath catch, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "In the city," she replied evenly. Walking by the river, her father studied her, his silence stretching like a blade. Then he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Do not lie to me, Isabella. You've met someone." Her heart lurched, but she held her ground. "And if I have?" she asked, her voice trembling only slightly. Richard's jaw tightened, his fury barely contained. "You are my daughter. You do not throw your life away on some servant." The word was spit like poison. "You will end this. Do you hear me? You will end it, or I will end it for you." Isabella's hands clenched at her sides, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "I will not," she said quietly, but with a firmness that startled even her. For a brief moment, father and daughter stood locked in a silent war, the air between them charged with decades of unspoken rebellion. Richard's eyes burned into hers before he turned sharply and walked away, his steps echoing like thunder in the hall. Daniel, too, felt the weight of the tightening noose. Men began appearing near his workplace, watching him with cold, assessing eyes. He pretended not to notice, but inside he knew the truth. They were her father's men. And worse still, he recognized one of the faces, not from the mansion, but from his past. The sight made his stomach twist with dread. His past was no longer something he could keep buried. It was clawing its way into the present. That night, when he walked home through the narrow streets, he heard footsteps following him. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding, but the footsteps stayed close. Finally, he turned into an alley and spun around, his fists clenched. A man stepped forward, his smile cold and familiar. "Well, well," the man said, his voice dripping with menace. "If it isn't Daniel playing at being respectable, working in a fancy mansion, wooing the boss's daughter. You've forgotten where you came from, haven't you?" Daniel's blood ran cold. The past he had fought so hard to escape had found him, and now it threatened not only his own life but Isabella's as well. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his small room, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He thought of Isabella's smile, her defiance, her unwavering belief in him. He thought of her father's fury, the men who watched him, the dangerous figure from his past now lurking in the shadows. He knew he could not hide the truth forever, but he also knew that once she learned it, their love might never be the same. Could she still love him when she saw the darkness he carried? Could she still stand beside him when she realized he was not the man she thought, but someone who had once walked the same alleys as criminals, someone who had made mistakes that could never fully be erased? These questions tormented him, but the one thought that kept him awake was this. If he told her, he risked losing her. If he stayed silent, the truth would destroy them both anyway. It was only a matter of time. Daniel woke the next morning with a heaviness in his chest he could not shake. The face of the man from the alley haunted him, his mocking words circling his thoughts like vultures. He had thought he had outrun that life, the shadows of the streets, the debts, the choices he had once made when survival was his only concern. But the past had a way of clinging to you, waiting for the moment when your guard was down. As he scrubbed his face at the small sink in his room, he caught his reflection in the cracked mirror. He saw not the man Isabella believed in, not the man she thought was her escape, but the boy who had once stolen to eat, who had run messages for dangerous men because it was the only way to pay for his sister's medicine. Shame coiled inside him. He wanted to be the man she deserved, yet the truth gnawed at him, whispering that he was only building her dreams on lies. Meanwhile, Isabella was fighting battles of her own. Her father had grown colder since their confrontation, his silence heavy, his gaze sharper. He no longer raised his voice. Instead, he watched her with a calculating calm, as though weighing every move she made. Her mother began arranging dinners with wealthy families, each evening presenting Isabella with a new suitor dressed in polished shoes and rehearsed charm. Isabella endured these encounters with quiet rebellion, smiling politely, but never engaging. Each time she sat at the long dinner table beside her parents, she thought of Daniel, of his rough hands, his unpolished honesty, the warmth in his eyes that none of these men possessed. But her defiance came at a cost. Servants whispered, her mother's temper flared, and her father's patience thinned to a dangerous edge. Yet Isabella clung to her love with stubborn resolve. She had tasted freedom, and she would not surrender it. One evening she slipped away from the mansion to meet Daniel. The city streets were alive with lanterns and chatter, but in the small cafe where they sat together, the world shrank to just the two of them. Isabella leaned close, her voice low. He knows, Daniel. My father knows. He hasn't said your name, but I can feel it. He's watching every step I take. Daniel's hand tightened around his cup, his jaw clenching. Then we must be careful. We cannot give him reason to act. Isabella shook her head fiercely. No. Hiding will only make us weak. I told you, I will not let him decide my life. If he comes for us, then let him. I will not back down. Her words filled Daniel with both pride and fear. He loved her fire, but he knew her father was not a man to be challenged lightly. Richard Moretti had built his empire not just on wealth, but on fear, control, and the willingness to crush anyone who stood in his way. And Daniel feared that Isabella's defiance would only provoke him further. The shadow of Daniel's past returned again a few nights later. As he walked home from the cafe, he found the same man waiting at the corner of his street, leaning against a lamppost with a cigarette dangling from his lips. Daniel, the man drawled, his tone mocking. Or should I call you by the name you used back then? Remember those days? Running errands, making deals in back alleys, pretending you weren't knee-deep in the dirt like the rest of us. Daniel's fists clenched, his teeth grinding. That's not who I am anymore. The man laughed, blowing smoke into the night air. You can put on a clean shirt, pour drinks for rich people, even win the heart of a spoiled little princess. But people like us? We don't change, we just wait for the past to catch up. The man's words pierced him like knives, and Daniel knew he could no longer outrun what he had been. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would do whatever it took to protect Isabella from that world, even if it meant tearing himself apart. Isabella sensed his distance the next time they met. He smiled, he kissed her hand, but something in his eyes was shadowed, guarded. She pressed him gently, asking if something was wrong, but he only shook his head and changed the subject. Inside, however, Daniel was crumbling. He wanted to confess, to tell her everything, but each time the words rose to his lips, he swallowed them back down. How could he place that weight on her shoulders? How could he let her see the darkness he had come from? He feared that if she knew, she would see him differently, not as her love, but as a mistake. And so, he carried the burden in silence, even as it grew heavier with each passing day. Richard Moretti was not silent. He began to move pieces behind the scenes, calling in favors, summoning men who owed him loyalty. One afternoon, as Isabella sat by her window sketching absent-mindedly, she overheard her father's voice in his study. She leaned closer, straining to hear, her heart thudding. "Find out everything about him," her father said coldly. "Where he comes from, who he knows, what dirt he's hiding. No one touches my daughter without my permission." Isabella's blood turned to ice. She wanted to burst into the room, to scream that she was not his possession, but she held herself back. If her father was digging into Daniel's past, then it was only a matter of time before secrets came spilling out. Secrets Daniel had not yet trusted her with. Fear gnawed at her, but beneath it burned determination. If her father wanted a war, she would not run. She would face it, even if it meant shattering everything she knew. The city seemed to close in on them after that. Every meeting became a risk, every word a potential weapon. Daniel felt eyes on him constantly, shadows trailing him even in crowded streets. Isabella felt the walls of her home tighten, her freedom shrinking with each passing day. Yet in those rare stolen hours together, their love burned brighter, fiercer, as though the danger only sharpened their bond. They clung to each other not just for passion, but for survival. For Daniel, Isabella was the only light left in a life that had once been filled with darkness. For Isabella, Daniel was the only truth in a world built on lies. Together they felt invincible, but deep down, both knew that invincibility was an illusion. The storm was coming, and when it arrived, it would test not only their love, but their very survival. The storm finally broke one night in ways neither Isabella nor Daniel could have prepared for. Daniel was finishing his shift at the restaurant when two men in tailored suits stepped inside. They weren't customers. They didn't look at menus or ask for tables. They looked at him. Their eyes carried the weight of power, the kind that came with money and connections. The manager whispered something to Daniel, but the words barely registered. He already knew who had sent them. Richard Moretti was tightening his grip, pulling Daniel into the open. One of the men approached him casually, as though ordering a drink. "You're Daniel, aren't you? My boss would like a word." Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run, to disappear into the night as he had done many times before. But this wasn't just about him anymore. Isabella's safety hung in the balance. Slowly he nodded and followed the men out into the cool night air. They didn't take him far, just to a sleek black car parked across the street. Inside, Richard Moretti sat like a king in his throne, his sharp eyes scanning Daniel as though he were a bug pinned under glass. "So," Richard said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "this is the man who has captured my daughter's foolish heart." Daniel stood tall, though every instinct told him to bow or break. "I love her," he said quietly but firmly. Richard's lips curled into a cold smile. "Love? You think that word means anything in my world? You think you can stroll in from the gutter, with your hidden past, and take what is mine? No, Mr. Daniel, you don't love her. You're using her." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "I would never hurt Isabella. Whatever you think of me, she is not your property. She's her own person, and she loves me." The men beside Richard shifted uneasily, as though unused to hearing someone speak back to him. But Richard only leaned forward, his eyes burning. "I know who you are. I know where you came from. And soon, she will too." That night, Daniel walked home with his world collapsing around him. He knew Richard was telling the truth. Isabella would soon learn everything. The crimes he had once committed, the nights he had spent running messages for criminals, the things he had done out of desperation. He had never told her, never given her even a glimpse of the shadows that still followed him. He had wanted to protect her, to let her see only the man he had become, not the boy he had been. But now the choice was gone. His secrets would be dragged into the light, twisted into weapons against him. The fear of losing her pressed on him like a weight he could hardly bear. Yet beneath the fear was a spark of resolve. If she was to hear his story, it would not be from Richard Moretti. It would be from him. Isabella was waiting for him the next evening, her eyes anxious, her hands trembling slightly as she held his. "My father called me into his study," she whispered. "He didn't say much, but I could feel it. He knows something. He's hiding something about you. Daniel, what is it? What is he talking about?" Daniel looked at her, his chest tight, his mind spinning with words he wanted to say but could not bring himself to. He opened his mouth, closed it, and turned away. "It's complicated," he muttered. Isabella's grip tightened on his hand. "Then explain it." "I don't care how complicated it is. I need to hear it from you, not from him." Daniel's silence stretched between them like a chasm. He wanted to trust her, but the fear of losing her held him back. Isabella's eyes filled with hurt, but she nodded slowly. "If you won't tell me, then I'll find out myself." The next days blurred into tension and shadows. Isabella watched her father more closely, catching fragments of conversation, glimpses of documents locked in his desk. Daniel avoided her gaze, retreating into himself, working longer hours at the restaurant as though distance could shield her from the truth. But the truth would not stay hidden. One evening, Isabella slipped into her father's study when he was away. Her heart pounded as she opened the top drawer of his desk. Inside, she found a thin folder with Daniel's name written across it. Her hands shook as she opened it, scanning the words inside. Arrest records, witness accounts, mentions of gangs and debts, of nights spent in police custody, of a boy who had grown up with nothing and survived by stepping into the shadows. Her chest tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She read every word, her mind racing. This was not the Daniel she knew. The man who looked at her with love, who treated her with respect, who risked everything to be by her side. And yet, it was him. It was a part of him he had never shown her. When Daniel came to see her that night, she was waiting. The folder lay open on the table between them. He froze when he saw it, his face pale, his shoulders sagging as though the last defense around his heart had been shattered. Isabella looked at him, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide this from me?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Because I didn't want you to see me like that. I didn't want you to know the things I had to do. I was a kid, Isabella. I had nothing. My sister was sick. We couldn't pay rent, and the streets don't care about children. I did what I had to do to survive. But that's not who I am anymore. I left it behind. I tried to build something better." His voice broke, his eyes pleading. "I didn't want to lose you." For a long moment, Isabella said nothing. She looked at him, at the man she loved, and at the shadow of the boy he had once been. Her heart ached with confusion, with fear, with love that refused to let go. Slowly, she reached across the table and took his hand. "You should have trusted me," she whispered. "I would have stood by you. I still will. But you must never hide from me again. Do you hear me, Daniel? Never." His breath caught, and he nodded, tears burning his eyes. For the first time in days, hope stirred between them. But the storm was not over. Outside the walls of that small room, Richard Moretti was already laying his final trap. Richard Moretti did not strike immediately after Isabella discovered the truth. He was patient, deliberate, waiting for the right moment. For days, Isabella noticed the strange quiet in her father's demeanor, the faint smile that curled at his lips whenever she walked into the room. It was the smile of a man who knew he had already won. She told herself it was an illusion, that her father's power was not absolute. but deep down she felt the dread curling inside her. She clung to Daniel with renewed determination, believing that love would be enough, that if they held on to each other they could outlast the storm. Yet storms do not fade because of hope. They crash with thunder and fury, and Richard was already preparing to unleash his. The trap came in the form of an invitation. One evening, Isabella was handed a sealed envelope by a servant. Inside, written in her father's precise handwriting, was a summons to dinner, formal, cold, and final. She knew what it meant. He was calling her into battle, not just with words, but with the weight of his authority and wealth. She told Daniel that night, and he begged her not to go. "He's not asking you, Isabella. He's commanding you. And if you walk into that room, he will tear us apart." But Isabella shook her head, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Then let him try. I will not hide. I will not let him decide who I love." The night of the dinner was heavy with silence. The long dining table gleamed under the chandelier, the silverware polished, the wine already poured. Richard sat at the head, his wife by his side, her eyes flickering nervously between husband and daughter. Across from Isabella sat Daniel. She hadn't expected him to be there, but clearly her father had orchestrated this confrontation with cruel precision. Daniel looked tense, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between Isabella and Richard. No words were exchanged as the first course was served. The air was thick, suffocating, until Richard finally set down his fork and folded his hands together. "Isabella," he began, his tone calm but laced with venom, "you sit here tonight as my daughter, but you dishonor me with the company you keep. Do you think love excuses a man's sins? Do you believe a boy from the gutter, with a record stained by crime, can ever be worthy of you?" His words sliced the air, and Isabella's chest tightened. She glanced at Daniel, who sat rigid, his hands trembling slightly on the table. "I know everything," Richard continued. "The arrests, the gangs, the debts. This man is not who you think he is. He will destroy you, and I will not stand by while my daughter throws away her life on a lie." Daniel's breath shook, but before Isabella could respond, he spoke. His voice was steady, though his eyes burned with pain. "You're right," he said quietly. "I did those things. I was that boy. I made choices I regret every day of my life. But you don't know the whole story. I did it to survive. I did it to protect my family when no one else would, and I walked away from it. I built a new life. I'm not perfect, but I am not that boy anymore." He looked at Isabella then, his voice softening. "I should have told you. I was afraid. But everything I've given you, everything I've felt, it has always been real." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Real?" He scoffed, his voice rising. "Real is the life I built for you, Isabella. Real is the empire that gives you everything you could ever want. And you would throw it away for this?" He spat the word like venom, glaring at Daniel as though he were filth on his shoe. Isabella's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin, her voice strong. "Yes, father, I would throw it away. Because what you built is not life, it's a cage. You rule with money and fear, but you have no love, no warmth, no truth. Daniel may have a past, but he has a heart. He has honesty. And I would rather live in poverty with him than in a palace with you." The words struck the room like a thunderclap. For the first time, Richard's composure faltered. His face flushed with rage, his fist slamming against the table, the wine glasses trembling. "You are a fool," he roared. "You think love will shield you from the world? Love does not pay debts. Love does not protect you from betrayal. And mark my words, Isabella, this man will betray you. People like him always do." His voice dropped to a cold hiss. "If you choose him, then you are no daughter of mine." Silence followed, heavy and final. Isabella's breath came in shaky bursts, but she did not waver. She rose from her chair, her hands trembling as she reached for Daniel's. He stood beside her, his body rigid, his eyes locked on Richard. "Then so be it," Isabella said, her voice breaking but her spirit unyielding. "If I am no longer your daughter, then I will be myself. I will walk my own path." She turned to Daniel, her hand squeezing his. With him, Richard watched as they walked from the table, his fury simmering like molten steel. His wife reached for his arm, whispering for him to stop, but he shook her off. His pride was wounded, his control broken. But even in his rage, he knew the battle was not lost. He would let her go tonight, let her believe she had won. But Richard Moretti was not a man who gave up power easily. His daughter had declared war, and he would answer in kind. For Isabella and Daniel, the days that followed were both liberating and terrifying. They moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, the walls thin, the furniture sparse. For the first time in her life, Isabella washed her own clothes, cooked her own meals, and walked through streets where no one bowed their head to her name. It was hard, humbling, and yet exhilarating. Daniel worked tirelessly, taking extra shifts, while Isabella began teaching children at a local community center. They laughed together, cried together, and held each other in the darkness when doubts crept in. Their love deepened in ways neither of them had imagined, tested not by luxury but by struggle. But Richard's shadow lingered. There were whispers of men following Daniel home, of sudden inspections at his workplace, of anonymous calls that stirred suspicion. Richard had not abandoned his fight. He was pressing from the edges, trying to break them without laying his hands directly. Yet the more he pressed, the stronger Isabella's resolve became. She had chosen her path, and no amount of intimidation could force her back. In Daniel's arms, she found not just love but courage, and in her defiance, Daniel found strength to shed the shame of his past. Together they began to build something Richard could never understand, a life not built on fear or wealth, but on truth and resilience. The final blow came months later, when Richard tried one last time to lure Isabella back. He sent her a letter, handwritten, filled with promises of forgiveness, of wealth, of the life she had left behind. He begged her to reconsider, to return home, to leave Daniel before it was too late. Isabella read the letter in silence, then folded it carefully and set it aside. She turned to Daniel, who waited anxiously and smiled softly. "I don't need his forgiveness," she said. "I don't need his world. I have mine now. With you." And for the first time in years, Daniel felt the chains of his past fall away completely. He was no longer the boy defined by mistakes nor the man haunted by secrets. He was simply Daniel, loved, accepted, and free. Richard Moretti would never truly understand what he had lost. His empire remained, his wealth untouched, but his daughter's love was gone, and no amount of power could buy it back. Isabella never looked back. She and Daniel carved a life out of struggle, but it was theirs, honest, flawed, and real. And though the shadows of the past never disappeared completely, they no longer defined them. What defined them was the choice they had made, the courage to love in the face of fear, and the strength to build a future together no matter the cost. In the end, the rich man's daughter and the waiter with a dark past became something more than their names, more than their stations. They became a testament to the truth that love, though fragile, can endure anything, even secrets, even betrayal, even the wrath of those who seek to control it. And in that endurance they found not only each other, but themselves.